Okay, we're here with Rob King, Senior Vice President for SportsCenter and News. Rob, I've been kind of starting out these interviews by asking people kind of their backstory, how they got to ESPN, and I know from talking to you previously that you have an Illinois connection to your story.
Yeah, I did.
How did you start I know you're starting the business. Can you share that with the
Well, all I ever wanted to be was an editorial cartoonist, right? So I essentially graduated undergrad from Wesleyan University in Connecticut without a portfolio, which if you're going to be a cartoonist, I highly advise not to do that. Spent about a year living at home with my folks, which is survivable, but inadvisable. Sorted mail at the Washington Post. And then through the course of being there, found my way to a university fellowship at Penn State, where I could study for grad school for a year to study journalism. My plan there was to go to Penn State and actually figure out a way in the course of the master's program to become a better cartoonist, because I didn't have a portfolio and I wanted to work for a newspaper, and Penn State has a great one, the Daily Collegian, where I could get better at it. And I took the opportunity of a series of interviews that Gannett was having on campus to apply for a job in Danville, Illinois. 30 short miles, or 40 minutes in the awful car that I was driving at the time, from Champaign-Urbana. And I went there because it was the first place that said, yeah, you could do editorial cartoons. And I was there for a year, 2 weeks and 3 days, not that I was counting. But I spent my entire life really at the newspaper. I did editorial cartoons. I did a weekly one panel cartoon. But I was also a graphic artist, and I was also a general assignment reporter, and total immersion into the newspaper business. And even at that time, I could not have told you that job was going to lead to this job. It was literally an opportunity to do something that I wanted to do and learn other stuff that I needed to learn how to do. So if there's any lesson in the next however many minutes we talk, I would tell you that as somebody who's in school thinking about this career, the advice I have that I've gotten, from a dear friend years ago is, it's going to work out. You just don't know how yet. You have no idea, and you don't get to know, but it is going to work out. In my case, it worked out that I just found great mentors. I went from Danville to a newspaper outside of the Philadelphia area in Jersey. Lesson number 2, by the way. I went to that newspaper because I had a girlfriend in Philadelphia, and I got to that newspaper and turned out she had a boyfriend in Philadelphia. So again, another piece of advice, don't do that either. That was an important lesson learned. So I was outside of Philadelphia for about 5 years, then moved to Louisville, Kentucky, where I was there for 5.5 years, or as I like to think about it, 6 derbies, and then took a job at the Philadelphia Inquirer. And throughout those newspaper jobs, I was doing more refined stuff. I went from being a cartoonist to a designer of newspapers to overseeing photo department to learning management, a whole deal. Ultimately, when I got to the Philadelphia Inquirer, I was there a couple of years. I worked with a guy named Stephen A. Smith, who some folks might know. I joined the sports department as first a designer and then a deputy sports editor, and within 4 years, ESPN came along and made me an offer I couldn't refuse.
So you've been at ESPN now, and you've done many things here, but now you are overseeing the franchise, quote unquote, so to speak. Describe your duties as the head of SportsCenter and News at ESPN. What does that involve? What does that mean?
Well, it means a lot of things. SportsCenter is the central news and information brand for all of ESPN, and it is the biggest provider of highlight video and video in general across all platforms. It's also, the place that people feel the most at home. It's the first show that ESPN did, so our fans really spend a lot of time knowing and appreciating our talent. So I am responsible for everything from everything you see on air to what you might see online or in Snapchat or in other social feeds. I've spent a lot of time working with our news gathering group to report stories all around the world. I have oversight of Outside the Lines and E60, which are much more thoughtful and expansive exploratory journalism brands. It's a big job, and the only way that anybody can do it is that I'm blessed to work with some really, really talented people.
And so these students I'm with grew up with Sports Center. When we were coming up, Sports Center was still this new thing that we kind of, that was new, and it wasn't on 20, like it is now. What do you remember from Sports Center, as a viewer, that first kind of caught your attention, and how it kind of was a game changer, not only for ESPN but for the whole industry of sports?
Well, I'm old enough to remember a time, unlike everybody watching this, I'm old enough to remember a time where sports didn't occupy our conversation 24/7, 365. In order to be engaged with sports, you had to stay up and watch the night newscasts where sportscasters would get about 2.5 minutes to tell you everything that happened that day. And that was about as much sporting news as you're getting on television until ESPN decided that it was possible to do it 24/7, 365. I was in college when ESPN was in its infancy, so its second, third, fourth years. And I remember we would literally run back from basketball practice to watch whatever was being put on. We didn't even care. It was just sports. It was just sports on TV. Flash forward to today where it's not even a matter of serving a massive audience of sports fans that will come to your show at a certain time. You've got a massive audience of individuals who determine based on when they're ready to consume content, where they're going to spend their time. So SportsCenter at that time was just a convening spot. It was almost like a live game. It was, you went and sat there with your hordes of friends and you watched baseball highlights and basketball highlights and then highlights of screwy sports you'd never seen before, and you just reveled in that time together to hang out and watch sports. We have a much different mission now. And then the other thing I remember vividly, as I'm sure everybody does, we have always had amazing personalities. It's easy to forget, but people should never forget how important Chris Berman was to changing the way in which sportscasters talked about highlights. They should never forget somebody like Stuart Scott, who brought his own authenticity to how this was done. Dan Patrick and Keith Olbermann and Craig Kilborn were people who made it seem really cool. It was like, everything we think now about Jimmy Fallon and the way in which he owns The Tonight Show. That's what those guys did for that show. So there's been a long history of really memorable people in front of the camera, and happily we're continuing that history. But those folks. I mean, again, when I was watching, as when you were, David Letterman was a young hip guy. And so we've seen an entire generation of voices move on and make way to the next generation.
But that attitude or that presentation, that was, at the time, that was so groundbreaking. The idea we're going to have fun and we're going to come up with catchphrases. And then also the idea that we're not going to show you all the baseball highlights at one time. We're not going to compartmentalize and then all the football highlights and then we're going to show you a baseball game, and then maybe we're going to go to a hockey game or a college football game, kind of mix things up. Almost like a newspaper, not going to put everything on the front page.
Yeah, well,
how important was that?
Well, I'm lucky enough to have grown up in the Washington, D.C. area, and there was a guy named George Michael who had the Sports Machine, and he was the first person that I saw actually take advantage of, the wealth of sports content and add a layer of personality to it and just bring the energy all the time. And that's what SportsCenter really has owned over a long period of time. John Walsh, who's one of the geniuses who've ever walked the halls of ESPN, was the first person to suggest that our news report didn't have to be done in silos and buckets, that we could actually treat it as the news of the day, that there was a top story that happened today, and that when we were thinking about highlights, we didn't necessarily have to say, here's what happened in the first inning and here's what happened in the third inning, but we could go right to the moment of the game that was most impactful and then spin out other stories, and then come back to these sports later on in the show. And that's just an example of how, over the course of 37 years, a show like SportsCenter has evolved to really represent the way in which people consume storylines, and to always be mindful of what's exciting, what the point of conversation is, never to be stuck in the way in which it does things, because that's really, really important. Every show brand that we care about, every publication we care about, has been wise enough and aware enough of its audience to adjust. And where we started in 1979 with SportsCenter to where we are today is a story of adjustments, a story of recognition that people come to news in a lot of different ways now. People enjoy topics in a lot of different ways. People are watching games live, and so we now have the ability to see each other's thoughts in real time. We call it social, like it's a new thing, but people always had these thoughts and they always had these arguments. But now we can see that stuff. And so as people who are putting on a show, or people who are working content into social streams or in the digital platform, we can actually respond in real time to what we see people saying. But in the end, our core mission has always been the same, which is really serve sports fans with authenticity, with personality, with a sense of fun. And
one of the things you did last year was with Scott Van Pelt, and give him a show. It would be at 11 o'clock in the Central Time Zone. It's a little. How did that come about, and what was the idea behind that?
Well, in the end, Scott is one of the most transformative SportsCenter personalities we have, and it was a pleasure to start thinking along with the producers and Scott of ways in which we could take a SportsCenter, an hour of SportsCenter, and really wrap it around him. Because our thinking was this: in the last 2 or 3 years, The Tonight Show's changed a host. The Late Show that David Letterman had changed its host to Stephen Colbert. The Jon Stewart Show went to Trevor Noah. Daily Show. And so that late night period connection to a host was kind of up for grabs. So we saw this window at midnight where we literally thought we could do that same thing with SportsCenter. Meanwhile, Scott, over the course of 6 years, had built up a real connection with an audience based on the radio show he was doing. So while he was doing SportsCenter, he was also doing a 3-hour radio show that introduced new topics, new conceits that, if he were to build a SportsCenter from scratch, he'd want to bring along with him. In the end, it got down to the same question that has always led us to better solutions with SportsCenter, which is, why not? Why not try this? And then let that lead into, and what if, and then what if, and then what if? We also knew, kind of in our back pockets, that just through some fan research, of all the people we might want to start a show with, Scott was at the top of the list with Stuart Scott, and Stuart sadly passed away in June of 2014, in January of 2015, and we knew that in the course of really trying to connect with our audiences, what we had to do is take the legacy that Stu taught us, which was, a unique personality is something to embrace. It is something to hold on to tightly. Take that lesson and apply it to how we do SportsCenter. So Scott's show is really the first show that helped us really see what that looks like, which then informed some other things we've done since with shows at 7 o'clock in the morning and 10 o'clock in the morning and, at noon. Scott's show really showed us that truly engaging with our key personalities and getting a collection of people together to bring a new vision to each hour of SportsCenter was energetic internally and also something that fans could connect with.
One of the things that, and he's doing a great job, one of the things that became kind of a staple of your show, especially with so much content, you guys, is the round table discussion type thing, which wasn't prevalent in the early SportsCenters. The idea of engaging in some sort of a debate or just analysis, bringing more experts, including them onto the show. How did that come about? How was that?
I think that's been something that we've worked on a number of years, even before going into our new studio in June of 2014 or Scott's show. Because there's a balance, right? There's a balance of the information you get from people who played the game and the information you get from people who report on the game and people who've been working behind the scenes within teams and leagues. We've always tried to use our set as an opportunity to have those kinds of conversations. I think where it feels new and unique is that we really, over the last 3 or 4 years, have asked our anchors to bring more of their own backgrounds, their fandom, the questions that they have, an awareness of what our audience is asking into these conversations. And by the same token, the people we speak with, the analysts, the insiders, have the same connections with audiences through social means or what have you. And so we bring that into the set. We're really trying to answer questions that everyone's thinking about.
And this idea of how do you know, and you guys, I'm sure you have research and experience, what stories resonate on SportsCenter? Are there different, I know you guys do features and things. How do you decide, okay, we're going to do this at this point, this at that point? I mean, what stories beyond the highlights and the scores resonate with viewers?
Well, I wish I could tell you there's a real science to it. So in some cases, I mean, you could spend a lot of time looking at metrics, and there's some things that pop up, like, there's some athletes that will always resonate. We just this week, Michael Jordan came forward and said that he was going to donate money to 2 groups to take on issues that we've got in terms of understanding and unrest in the country. And that story on ESPN.com generated more than 9 million page views, the most read story since ESPN.com had its redesign. And it certainly had the same kind of impact from a television perspective. So Michael Jordan will always move the needle. Tiger Woods always moves the needle, and he hadn't played in who knows how long. And there are a handful of other athletes like LeBron James. There's some teams like the Dallas Cowboys and even the Lakers that will always generate that kind of fervor. We have long-standing research history that shows that a Red Sox-Yankees series outrates a Dodgers-Giants series in Los Angeles. So there are those things that we see. But by the same token, we're also driven by our own fandom. We're fans ourselves. And we spend time that most people can't watching every game and seeing every cool highlight. And we spend a lot of time now listening. As people watch our show and react in the social space, we're very aware of what we're saying, of how what we're saying resonates with our audience. And sometimes that's just opportunity. Sometimes if you see that, we've done a piece, I'll give you the best example. The Monmouth University bench, their basketball team's bench. A bunch of guys who have these really elaborate celebrations when great plays happen. We just decided to cut together a bunch of highlights of what they do on the sideline. That took off in social. That took off, in a number of directions, especially within our digital content. And that in turn led us to do features with them and bring them to campus. But that's a kind of virtuous cycle that happens when you're actually paying attention to what works with audiences. It can come from anywhere, It really can. There was some crazy video of a really funny kid sitting there I guess he was in the Little League. He was in stands at the Little League, staring our cameras down while we had a live game. And you could see in the social space how that was resonating. And once we put him in the SportsCenter, you could see how that was resonating. So there's, again, part of this is our fandom. Part of it is just our immersion in what our fans are thinking.
I know, lastly, you talk about the SportsCenter's constantly evolving, and one of the things, your job is to anticipate where it's going to go from here. Where is it going to go from here? What's down the road in a landscape that's changing, by the second?
Well, there are 2 things to look at. The first is, unlike most categories of news, much of sports lives on calendars years in advance. So we have the opportunity to start looking ahead at specific events and things that we want to cover and be really great at. In November, there's a Monday Night Football game in Mexico City, and we will be great at that. And it's a huge opportunity for a whole host of audiences, not the least of which is the audience that our partners, SportsCenter down in Mexico City, are trying to serve. So we can look months in advance and identify events that we think are going to be a big deal. But the truth is, we spend a lot of time across our company, and not just within SportsCenter, but across our business divisions and all of our divisions, thinking about our audience and how it changes and the ways in which they're dealing with content. I have a 3-person focus group of a son who's 12, a daughter who's 9, and a daughter who's 8. And I can tell you right now that when I leveled up to level 5 in Pokemon Go, I A, know what I was talking about, even though I'm 54. B, understood that this is really about augmented reality. It's not just about that momentary fad. It is about the willingness of many, many people to immerse themselves in experiences. And so even now we're talking about what's the immersive experience that either SportsCenter or ESPN can create that people will want to stay in. I read a book called Ready Player One that I would ask everybody to read. It's fiction, but it anticipates a future in which the augmented reality, virtual reality world is so attractive that people would rather live in that world. And I understand Steven Spielberg might be working on that film. I'm excited to see it because I do think like you can poo-poo that stuff and then just think 3 weeks ago we didn't know Pokemon Go existed. All right. So, you know, I think we're spending a lot of time looking at everything like that. We spend a lot of time from a technology perspective looking at the television screens of the future, both big or the ones we put in our pocket, and how we produce content for that space. We spend a lot of time looking at the digital native companies that are as much our competition as the television companies. I would just anticipate, if I were going to make any prediction, that it's going to be easier and more fun to be a sports fan than ever before as the years progress. You'll be closer to game action, closer to news and information, closer to the athletes. And I would anticipate that SportsCenter and ESPN are going to be at the heart of that.
Great. Thanks, Rob. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
All right, good. Thank you, sir. That was great.